Strong as death is love. American Yiddishkayt is an expression of love. It is a harvest of stories and people worth remembering, ideas worth defending, artifacts worth preserving, dangers worth fearing, relationships worth cherishing, wonders worth relishing with delight. It is an offering. It yearns even to be a love song, an anthem of forgiving, a manual for living with defeat. It is a solidarity with life. Its beating heart, beating, steady, under softly rising and falling loam, is the ancient Hebrew poet, strong as death is love. Strong as death is love. Strong as death is love. But love is particular. And American Yiddishkayt is a particular love. As an offering, as a love song, as the title of a book that I am writing, it comes out of a particular kind of life, a scholarly life. So there is a shift in tone, a shift in mood to describe how American Yiddishkayt fits into our scholarly life, to explain what it is in this setting, to tell you how and why I have come to gather it into text. Let me give you a sense of the context of my scholarly life. My training is in religious ethics, a subfield within the academic study of religion. In general, religious ethics is the study of distinctive ethical ideas that emerge from religious traditions. These are ideas that frame and answer questions about what people should and shouldn't do, what a good life looks like, and where to look for authoritative answers to such questions. Scholarship in religious ethics often involves studying the history and mechanics of these ideas, and sometimes promoting them as well. Most scholars in religious ethics view themselves as caretakers of religious traditions and advocates for religion as a positive contributor to society. My scholarship, by contrast, comes out of a frustration with the impact of American religion on Jews in America. Though Jews came to the United States in different waves at different times, they never fit easily upon arrival into the dominant American social categories. Sometimes they were already arguing amongst themselves about whether or not they constituted a religious group, an ethnic group, a racial group, a nationality, and so forth. At different phases and in different ways, a clear message emerged. Jews will be welcome to thrive in the United States as a white religious minority. I described this in my first book as the American invitation to disappear, be religious, or be a problem. In the early and mid-20th century, especially, this put enormous pressure on secular, socialistic, Yiddish-speaking Jews from Eastern Europe who were more likely to divide the world into Jewish and Goyish than into black and white. Most Jews ultimately donned the mask of American Judaism, but it chafed. It chafed even for rabbis and traditional Jews who resented having to make Jewish life recognizable as American religion. The religionization of Jewishness in America has produced more cynicism than love. But if I think that Jews in America have been trapped in the category of religion, and not Jews, and not only Jews, by the way, if I think that American Judaism has been a straitjacket on Jewish thriving, what is it that I want to thrive? What is it that I care about, that other people might care about, that is inhibited by the institutional demand that Jews count as a religious group? The answer is American Yiddishkayt. And it is just one example of the extraordinary variety of what people care about, what matters to people, what can hang together as a worldview, or a gestalt, or an ethos, what can pulse as a body of values, ideals, relationships, memories, aspirations, fears, that is not religion, or property, or blank happiness, even if these are so often presumed to be what our liberty is for. I have come to realize that what I care about as a scholar is caring about, mattering, love. I am interested in the profound human projects that are lost to the dehumanizing categories of identity that Philistine bureaucracies prefer. But I do not take the view from nowhere. I take the view from here. Much as I am apt to admire the philosopher who asks, "What is love?" I stand with the poet who asks, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." American Yiddishkayt is an expression of love. It is a harvest. It wants to be a love song. It is a life to live. It is a source of reasons to choose this or that, to pursue this goal and not that goal. It is a cluster of moods to be in. It is a doctored snapshot of consciousness. It is a constellation of goodness, truth, and beauty. The book that I'm writing, which has the title, American Yiddishkayt, the good, the true, and the beautiful, is not meant to be a secondary source about, say, the cultural legacy of Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants to the United States. It is meant to be a primary source that expresses a living legacy, an inheritance that I share with others. It is meant to concretize in an edifice of words, through the work of interpretation, a particular sense of what matters, a particular love. It has 7 parts. I will give you a sense of the overall structure and then explain in more detail a few of the features of its animating idea. It begins with a preface called From American Hebraism to American Yiddishkayt. The preface is meant to orient readers to the kind of idea that they are about to meet. I reflect on the philosopher Horace Kallen's idea of American Hebraism, which he wrote about almost exactly 100 years ago. I suggest that readers will find American Yiddishkayt similar in many respects to Kallen's idea, but also quite different. The 5 main chapters that follow are meant to have the quality of shifting moods, shifting kinds of attention imbued with feeling, shifting frames for experiencing and moving through the world. The first main chapter introduces the outer limits of American Yiddishkayt. It is American Yiddishkayt in the mood to ask fundamental questions about origins, authority, fate, time, space, existence. It is called In the Beginning, Kafka's World. The next 3 chapters follow the titular trifecta. Couldn't resist that. Chapter 2, In a Mood for Political Struggle, is called The Good, a Yiddishkayt for liberal social democracy. Chapter 3, in the drudgery of everyday life is called the true death of a godless Jew. Chapter 4, in the distinct repose of aesthetic attention, is called the beautiful figures of failure. The last main chapter works through the neurotic temptation to theorize and justify American Yiddishkayt. It is called The Time to Come, Jewishness Without Justification. In a final fragment, just a couple of pages long, entitled Into Life, I throw the reader back into the flow of American Yiddishkayt with short bursts of enthusiasm, responding with the force of invigorated wholeheartedness to the questions, what is good? What is true? What is beautiful? I will give you glimpses of Kafka's world, the good and the true, in what follows. The other elements will only appear, sadly, in the distance. First, though, let me say a few words about Horace Kallen's American Hebraism and why it is a helpful point of reference. At the start of the 20th century, Kallen was a publicly engaged Jewish intellectual, and he eventually became a founding professor of philosophy at the New School in New York City. He wrote in 1910, "In history, the culture of the Jews appears as no mere religion. It is called Hebraism, not Judaism, and to be a lover of Hebraism is more than to be a Judaist." Judaists, in his view, wanted to replace the whole Hebraism with an exaggeration of one of its parts, Judaism. Even if, he wrote, anybody who counts himself as a Jew is classed by the census taker as a Judaist, he insisted that Jews, in fact, are, in his words, secular-minded, skeptical, and this worldly. Kallen argued adamantly for a Jewishness that he thought could thrive with sincerity in America, for an American Hebraism. You can hear already some of what American Yiddishkayt shares in common with Kallen's American Hebraism. Both are expressions of a Jewish potentiality that is suppressed by the Judaist distortion. And there are many more corresponding features. One that I want to note relates to language politics. Kallen was not promoting Hebraism as a Hebrew language revivalism. His sense of Hebraism was a revision of the Hebraism that Matthew Arnold had contrasted to Hellenism. Likewise, American Yiddishkayt is not meant to be a revival of Yiddishism, which is the political ideology that promotes the Yiddish language as the central organizing framework for future Jewish thriving. The Yiddish word Yiddishkayt is best translated into English as Jewishness, and has come to be associated with the secular culture of Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jews. The Yiddish used in my book functions as post-vernacular language. Its symbolic meaning entirely supersedes its usage as an instrumental vernacular language. The Yiddish language carries only a very small part of the living legacy of Ashkenazi Jewry in America. American Yiddishkayt lives in North American English. Let's try now to sense what it is like to be in the world in this way. American Yiddishkayt happens within distinct realms of time, space, and existence, which correspond to its elemental moods, where another ethos might be founded on a divine revelatory event, or justified by an analytically delineated meta-ethics, American Yiddishkayt wanders eternally in Kafka's world. Franz Kafka's novels and stories emerged in English translation in the 1930s in the US as something more than mere literature for Jewish intellectuals. Kafka's writing has been a portal through which to confront the fundamental, unresolvable human and Jewish crises wrought by modernity, alienation and vulnerability under clumsy, unpredictable bureaucracies, technologies, and majorities. The imprint of order without law, traditions without authority, castles without kings, the comedy and the travesty of it all. In American Yiddishkayt, when you start looking for answers to ultimate questions, Kafka's world is where you end up. But Kafka's world is all fragments, ruins, broken chains, primordial cave art, somehow found in an office, written on a typewriter. Kafka's world is a permanent rejection of all mythic and rationalist and progressive answers to ultimate questions. It is an endless shuffling of time periods, proximity and distance, form and substance, gesture and meaning, weight and size, a disorder of ordered remnants haunted by a spectral obligation that never materializes. Philip Rav, a major figure among the 20th century's New York Jewish intellectuals, wrote in 1939 that Kafka evokes myth against myth. Rav described Kafka's stories this way. One might call them experimental myths. As meanings, they move strictly in a circle, for they always return to their point of departure, namely the uncertain, the unknown, the unfathomable. Hence, their beginnings and ends are really identical. A Kafkian story restricts itself to the description of the middle of a situation, leaving its origin and culmination to fuse in our minds into a single mystery. Obviously, the myth as procedure, the myth as a technique of investigation, is the myth inverted, the myth standing on its head. In Kafka's stories, according to Rav, destiny, God, the law, are in an exhausted condition, no longer a means of mythologically unifying reality, but of decomposing it. Once the lively, in Rav's words, once the lively and fertile emanations of primitive fear, of tribal need and desire, they now exist only as dead letters in a statute book. Building on to Rav, attend now in Kafka's world to the story of the new advocate, where Bucephalus, the war horse of Alexander the Great, has somehow entered the legal profession. In general, the bar approves the admission of Bucephalus. With astonishing insight, people tell themselves that modern society being what it is, Bucephalus is in a difficult position. And therefore, considering also his importance in the history of the world, he deserves at least a friendly reception. Nowadays, it cannot be denied, there is no Alexander the Great. So perhaps it is really best to do as Bucephalus has done and absorb oneself in law books. In the quiet of lamplight, his flanks unhampered by the thighs of a rider, free and far from the clamor of battle, he reads and turns the pages of our ancient tomes. In Kafka's world, Bucephalus heeds the words of Ben Bagbag from the ancient rabbinic text, the Mishnah. In the Dekel Israel translation. Ben Bagbag says, turn it and turn it, for everything is in it, and look into it, and grow old and worn in it, and do not move from it, because there is no better measure for you than it. In an essay on Kafka from 1934, written in Germany by Walter Benjamin, which has reverberated powerfully among Jewish intellectuals in the US, Benjamin addresses the new advocate. Is it really the law which could thus be invoked against myth in the name of justice? No. As a legal scholar, Bucephalus remains true to his origins, except that he does not seem to be practicing law. And this is probably something new, in Kafka's sense, for both Bucephalus and the bar. The law, which is studied, but no longer practiced, is the gate to justice. The gate to justice is study. Benjamin explicitly relates this sense of study to the ancient rabbis. But he also insists that study in Kafka's world differs from study for Ben Bagbag and his friends in the Mishnah, since in Kafka's world, what is studied is detached from fundamental authority. It is untethered and unmoored. In taking this position, Benjamin fails to follow his own advice. He reads forward rather than in reverse. He reads Kafka after the rabbis rather than reading the rabbis after Kafka. In Kafka's world, Ben Bagbag and Bucephalus turn it and turn it together. And whatever gates appear, whether to justice or anything else, they do not enter them. And if some of those gates are gateways for the Messiah, who would know the difference? It is well known that the Messiah, upon entering such a gate, would be immediately absorbed into study. So who can tell the difference between the Messiah and the next student, scholar, friend who comes to the table of study? In Kafka's world, at the limit of our sense of time, space, and existence, there is a centrifugal pull to infinite interpretation in the life of study. And creative, open-ended interpretation itself is eternally renewed as the most profound human activity. Transient, useless, infinite interpretation that crumbles immediately, a fleeting taste of order in chaos. More, always more of it, more. I will not address it at length here, but Kafka's world has a fundamental antagonist, an enemy. It is what I call Eliot's City of God, referring to T.S. Eliot and through him to Augustine of Hippo. Kafka's world is forever threatened by the supersessionist intentions of Eliot's City of God. From the perspective of American Yiddishkayt, Eliot's City of God is a menace that hovers over Kafka's world, ready to read Kafka's writings as merely an apt diagnosis of modern alienation, which can assuredly be cured once and for all by the good news of faith, scientism, technology, political ideology, or some other false messiah. American Yiddishkayt persists wryly in Kafka's world, despite incessant, smug invitations to resolution in Eliot's City of God. In American Yiddishkayt, Kafka's world is always in the corner of your eye, and always pulling you back to the table of study and interpretation. But you might be pulled in other directions too. American Yiddishkayt is characterized by a distinctive sense of the political good, a set of intuitions about what government should do, what people owe each other, what we should worry about collectively, what we should struggle for. Irving Howe, another major figure among the New York Jewish intellectuals of the 20th century, can represent this position. Howe wrote an influential history of Ashkenazi Jewish immigration to the United States, anthologized Yiddish fiction in English, co-founded the political journal Dissent. He lived the political life steeped in American Yiddishkayt. He represents the Yiddishkayt, the Jewish mind for liberal social democracy. When Howe describes the reforms that he advocates in 1985, at the age of 65, he offers a kind of intuitive baseline for liberal social democratic policy. Here is what he writes. First, immediate reforms, civil rights, women's rights, racial equality. Second, structural reforms, such as tax proposals, aiming at a gradual redistribution of income and wealth, and efforts to achieve full employment. He describes this as an extending and deepening of the welfare state. And finally, reforms that would begin to change the fundamental relationships of power and property. From the perspective of American Yiddishkayt, these are obvious commitments that should guide participation in American political life. They are goals that determine what will be supported and what will be opposed. But no less obvious are Howe's cautionary reflections on socialism, which he expresses as a lifelong socialist. For instance, the abolition of capitalism is not necessarily a step toward human liberation. It can lead, and has led, to societies far more repressive than capitalism at its worst. A complete transformation of humanity is a corrupt fantasy that can lead to a mixture of terror and apathy. Socialism should be envisaged as a society in which the means of production, to an extent that need not be determined in advance, are collectively or socially owned, which means democratically controlled. An absolute prerequisite is the preservation and growth of democracy. What makes this a social democratic view is the presumed fundamental relationship between socialism and democracy. Howe writes, there is no undemocratic road to socialism. There are only undemocratic roads that can bring and have brought nations to barbaric mockeries of the socialist idea. The transition from capitalism to socialism is likely to be a lengthy process, interrupted by setbacks, and fraught with tensions, conflicts, difficulties, and errors. But if it be a socialism for free men and women, there can be no other way. The importance of freedom, of choice, mobility, expression, for every individual is essential to this political sensibility, and it is what makes it a liberal, social, democratic view. The political mood of American Yiddishkayt is haunted by, among other things, the capacity of undemocratic, anti-liberal, left-wing radicalism to produce reactionary effects that bolster right-wing domination. Howe was particularly disturbed by the immediate pre-Hitler period, the period between the wars. He reflected on this period. In the joyful brutality of their verbal violence, many intellectuals at both ends of the political spectrum did not realize how profound a stake they had in preserving the norms of liberalism. They felt free to sneer at liberalism, because in a sense they remained within its psychological orbit. They could not really imagine its destruction and took for granted that they would continue to enjoy its shelter. Even the most authoritarian among them could not foresee a situation in which their freedom would be destroyed. Dreaming of natural aristocrats or sublime proletarians, they helped pave the way for maniac lumpen. In American Yiddishkayt, Kafka's world is where you end up when you're in the mood to wonder about ultimate things. In a political frame of mind, judgment and action are guided by a Yiddishkayt for liberal social democracy. But day to day is the humbling, frightening, aggravating, but hilarious negotiation of life as a dying animal, distinguished only by the outsized impacts of its endeavors and the absurdity of its self-consciousness. In a mood to face the truth, to respond to the real demands of the day, this is when the secularity of American Yiddishkayt is most salient. The truth is in the anxiety, desire, disappointment, decay, mortality, and mourning that define life in this mercilessly material world. But the truth is also that there can be a refuge in the warmth of others, in tenderness, humor, friendship, and family. The ancient Hebrew poet who wrote the Song of Songs expressed the truth in the words, "Strong as death is love." Love is as strong as death, but not stronger. This is the essential truth of American Yiddishkayt. When two equal powers clash, either one can be the winner. The situation is fundamentally precarious. Against all of the pending destructions, against all of the falling apart, against the inevitable drift into cynicism and the feeling of meaninglessness, against the really and truly fragile human body, there is the hugging human body, the loving human body, the feeling that another person can be for you a home. This is called Heimishkeit in Yiddish. But it doesn't always win. Because our relentless mortality and the cold indifference of the cosmos are just as strong. There is a place where people believe that love is stronger than death. It is called Eliot's City of God. From the perspective of American Yiddishkayt, it is a house of delusion and a betrayal of the human. The truth is not always the truth of bodies. Saul Bellow, writing about writing, speaks the truth. If we do care, if we believe in the existence of others, then when we write, it's necessary. The writer asks himself, why shall I write this next thing? It is still possible, despite all theories to the contrary, to answer, because it is necessary. A book, any book, may easily be superfluous, but to manifest love, can this be superfluous? Is there so much of it about? Not so much. It is still rare, still wonderful, that it can never be superfluous to gesture toward others through writing, that it can never be superfluous to manifest love. There is an echo in this of something even more profound than truth, of Kafka's world, where study and interpretation can never be superfluous. there is also a grinning, mischievous truth that is a secret pride of American Yiddishkayt, which is that hate is also as strong as death. Good, biting, furious ire about the whole travesty, about all the disappointment, about the plight of death itself. That too is strong, and all mixed up with the love. Love for what is hated and hate for what is loved, all bursting in a great refusal of nothingness. This is what Philip Roth captures in his novel Sabbath's Theater. Roth's writing is representative of the mood of truth in American Yiddishkayt, even if it is often because he plays so rough with the truth. Here is the night of self-destructive debauchery, Mickey Sabbath. Yes, yes, yes. He felt uncontrollable tenderness for his own shit-filled life and a laughable hunger for more defeat, more disappointment, more deceit, more loneliness, more disastrous entanglement in everything. For a pure sense of being tumultuously alive, you can't beat the nasty side of existence. I may not have been a matinee model, but say what you will about me, it's been a real human life. Roth is not making an argument for deceit, loneliness, and disaster. He is inviting us to admit that this too is humanity. This too is what we're in it for, what we're in for. Don't say love and life stand against hate and death. No. Love and hate, which are life, together stand against death. Roth even hints that this is a Hebrew humanism. He has Mickey ranting at one point about the God of the Hebrew Bible. It's a God who destroys. It's the spirit of a God that comes down to destroy. And yet it's a God who gives life. What in all of creation is as nasty and strong as this God who gives life? The God of the Torah embodies the world in all its horror and in all its truth. You've got to hand it to the Jews. Truly rare and admirable candor. What other people's national myth reveals their God's atrocious conduct and their own? Just read the Bible, it's all there. The backsliding, idolatrous, butchering Jews and the schizophrenia of these ancient gods. But Sabbath's Theater is a book about grief. Its real center is Mickey's love for his brother, Morty, who he lost at an early age in the war against Imperial Japan, and how this impacted his relationship with his mother. It is full of longing for moments of childhood fun and tenderness that he could never get back, which he could never get over. Barreling towards self-destruction throughout the novel, Mickey could never really give up on his life. In the end, he has to affirm that yes, hate too is as strong as death. The last line of the book is this: how could he leave? How could he go? Everything he hated was here. That is also the epigraph to my first book, which is about not giving up on America. The beautiful remains in the distance. Leonard Cohen's poetry and music are representative. It is Cohen who sings, he wants to write a love song, an anthem of forgiving, a manual for living with defeat. Cohen is the bard of Kafka's world, the poet laureate of the good, the troubadour of the true. His is the beauty in figures of failure. He is Cynthia Ozick's pagan rabbi. His beauty is in his necessary and extravagant failure to be both a poet and a Jew. And questions remain in a modern mood of anxiety about legitimation. What justifies these claims to goodness, truth, and beauty? And the answer is nothing. American Yiddishkayt does not need or want to be justifiable or justified. It is the source of justification. American Yiddishkayt is not universal. It is not the culture of an empire, nor is it the culture of a nation state. It is a particular love. It is a distinct sense of history, a distinct feeling for the world. It is even a distinct masculinity, which doesn't say, be a man, but be a mensch. It is the heartbeat of a minority, of a minority, of a minority. And it is satisfied to be tolerated as such. It is offered to be savored, befriended, studied, lived with, or against, not accepted. Since I was an undergraduate, I have savored and studied a book by the German Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig called The Star of Redemption, which was originally published in 1921. The heart of the book is an interpretation of the Song of Songs, 8:6. Love is strong as death. Rosenzweig's book points emphatically into life. He even instructed the printer to have the text fall into life and point into life. American Yiddishkayt points in the same direction. Thank you for joining me at the table of study. For the moment, this concludes my interpretation of these words. Strong as death is love. Thank you. Anything? Thoughts, questions, comments, queries? Yes.
I was interested in many comments, but one comment you made about that, I can't quote you, but you said Yiddish is not the something of American Yiddishkayt, it's North American English. And I'm very interested and somewhat immersed myself in the sort of revivalist Yiddishist stuff going on. And I wonder how the revival of Yiddish as an expression of the old, but also an expression of modernity sort of fits into the currents you describe. Where does that piece fit into your view of American Yiddishkayt?
Yeah, it's definitely related. And the draw to Yiddish as the Mamaloshen, as the language of the people, as having this quality of, this is really what my grandparents spoke, right? Who didn't speak Hebrew, right? There's a part of that is very powerful in modern Jewish political projects of different kinds. And I think it has affected mine certainly as well. But every time that I have, in the process of coming to this project, gone down that path of I'm going to immerse myself in Yiddish, I'll be able to understand the poetry at a different level, I'll be able to listen to and I still have a little bit of that temptation. But I know that I'm going to search for something else. Because because there's something that I'm living that is also the basis for a real life with real living motivation that's already there. And so the question of introspection and the kind of reflective, introspective work from which this kind of project can emerge, it can take a lot of different paths. And one of them, I think, can be down that road of a kind of language politics, either in terms of Yiddish or Hebrew or Ladino or other kinds of Jewish languages. But I think, even though I'm certainly guilty of a whole range of different kinds of romanticism, that particular romanticism, for some reason, I resist. And part of it is because I want to be able to savor and draw out what is powerful in the language that I live American Yiddishkayt in, so that there's a quality of it. And there's a part of the project in that last part on justification. It relates to Emerson, who is a very formative figure in my sort of methodological thinking, you might say. But there's a sense of whatever I need is already here. And there's a relational process of becoming new and renewing myself in relationships with thinkers and texts and through interpretation and so forth. But I don't want to betray where I am and what's really living and happening and relating. Yeah.
I think if I may, I'd like to give short shrift to the piece of the reemergence movement, let's call it, of Yiddishism, because it's not so backward-looking at all. I mean, I'm generalizing, but it's much more about more about what you're talking about. I feel like American Yiddishism, to sort of turn phrase, is much more like what you're describing, and that Yiddish as a language gets pigeonholed, right, into what you're avoiding almost, but it doesn't have to be thus. That's what I was saying.
No, I appreciate that. And I think, in the end, my view, as I said, this is not a totalizing view. In the world, and I would love to see also American Yiddishism thriving and go visit it. You know what I mean? But I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Yeah, Kai and, yeah.
So I want to clarify the Walter Benjamin a little bit.
Please.
A very common interpretation of Kafka and of Benjamin's essay on Kafka is that Kafka's world, not to use your phrase, but how most people view Kafka's world, or how a lot of people view Kafka's world, is that it's characterized by some break. There is like some transition from a pre-modern world into a modern world, and something seems to be lost in that transition, something that has become permanently irretrievable. That's what Benjamin, like in the passage that you're citing for us, what Benjamin is kind of saying, that Kafka's students don't have the Holy Writ. So my question to you is, do you think that he's wrong in that there is no real break, and that in fact there is no real alternative? There has never really been an alternative to Kafka's world?
It's a great question. And Kai wrote an excellent paper on this in my class. It's a great question. I guess that there's a way of looking at this story that I'm telling, or what I'm trying to depict, the way that we start in that class, my class, Judaism Before the Law, where we can take a perspective where we can see a break, right? And that, I think, has a lot of value to it as a starting position from what our intuitions are. But I think that in Kafka's world, the sense of the break is itself already relativized. It's itself one of the ordered pieces in disorder. So it can't function in the linear way that you're describing as a break, right? There's the evocation of a break, which is part of the anxiety and part of the longing, but it's not a break per se on its face. Like that's because that would be too reliable in and of itself. Yeah, Max.
I feel that the idea of Yiddishkayt can sometimes be a little bit nebulous. Would you define it as a cultural heritage or as a uniquely Jewish way of relating to the world intellectually? Are those two things somewhat in opposition, or is it something else entirely?
Yes, purposefully nebulous. You've put your finger on that well, Max. I list off a few different kinds of things that one might want to use to describe as terms, like worldview or gestalt or ethos, right? Inheritance, right? I'm a little bit reluctant to put it in a category like that, in part because the motivation is precisely to have the freeing quality of not being constrained by those kinds of meta-categories. So my preference is to use a variety of different kinds of references that attend the mind to whatever those kinds of terms are pointing to, which is some animating quality of judgment and will and concern and mattering and love that there's not, once we start carving it up, then we lost it. Then we're having another kind of conversation, and we're going to find ourselves in all kinds of traps of skepticism that we don't need to fall into. And so I think it's an absolutely great question about, so what is this? You said it's not a religion, but is it you said you've studied ethics, is that, right? I mean, it's a perfectly legitimate, right? But I think part of the idea is keep it at bay. That's the temptation. We'll make it one of these, and then everybody will have one, and then, right? And once we start doing it, then it's all chopping everybody up, and then we're back into the problem that I'm trying to sort of allow us to see possibilities outside of. But it's a key question. So my answer is totally unsatisfying, but satisfying like in the other way. Maud.
You're so resistant to categories, and I'm a historian, right? So I'm like, oh, is this historically bounded? Is this a place? And I didn't want to ask you that question, so I'm going to ask you a different question, but it comes from the same place, which is your title. You've called this American.
Yeah.
So I was worrying about like, is an American in this decade or this decade, because that's what historians do. But I guess I'm, just to make it a more open-ended question, more a Jeff Israel question than a Maud question, would be, what's American about the project?
That's a great question, Maud. And it really is, because there's a whole part of this that I can't do here, which actually gets to some of the categories and such, which is that, and I'm not going to be able to do it justice here, but the view is, as all things are, embedded in institutional realities, institutional historical realities, power, structures of power, and so forth, institutions that already exist and promote this or that. What's the clearest way to say this? On some level, I think, and I hate this kind of metaphor, but I'm going to use it anyway because it's the one that comes to mind. The deepest operating system of this view is some kind of American, very specifically American cultural life. And the Emersonian element, the element that is, I'm going to try to rip my chest open and show my heart and let it be a kind of visible register of some kind of truth that will strike a chord with truth in every other heart, right? That sensibility is very much a particular American sensibility. And so I guess there's a whole range of ways in which American Yiddishkayt is a story about different kinds of ethical lives, ethoi, right, that have emerged in America, in the United States in particular, as a result of its pressures and the way it pushes you into self-understanding and longing for roots and desire for individuality, right? That those features are very much part of the deeper justificatory work that's happening, even though it's not asking for justification. Does that, it points in the direction. We'll talk. Yeah, and then we'll go to you. Yeah.
I just want to add to what Maud was saying. So I've been in this country for 40 years. My Yiddishkayt is as instilled in me as yours, and I'm African.
Yeah.
And nothing that you said today is strange to me or different to me. So I'm not sure that you can claim that definition of Yiddishkayt. It is the thing that in my later years has made me understand, come to terms with my identity as a Jew in a world which I'm struggling with because of things that that my grandmother, like so many of us, taught me. She was an uneducated woman, but she taught me about humanity. And slowly, slowly, I've come to take that now in my 70s as a way of calming down and knowing that I face this world in a certain way. So I must put in a word for South African.
Well, so, and I think I mean, look, it's not. I think part of the motivation is also not to try to speak too much. I don't know what it's like to be from South Africa, right? Like the sources and the particular elements that I'm drawing from are trying to resist to universalizing, generalizing claims. That's why it emerges to then be befriended, to then be added to then be joined, or right? And by the way, it's also even clear from what I've said, there are all sorts of elements that are not just coming from the United States here. Kafka, Walter Benjamin, right? The Hebrew Bible, right? I mean, right? So and there are all sorts of, I think, convergences that happen from different histories and kinds of consciousness that come out of that world of Ashkenazi Jewry. But other questions that are similar, which can be asked, are, well, where does Yiddishkayt end, and where does sort of Jewishness more broadly, or Judaism, begin? What about non-Yiddish speaking Jews, right? Jews who are not Ashkenazi, right? There's a whole world, there's a whole set of questions about where borders are drawn here and how limits are delineated. But from my perspective, they're important. And it's important to take the hit on the particularity of the project, because it's the instinct to say, well, no, it will be then, I can make it satisfying to you, but I don't want you to feel like, right? That's the thing to resist, because it's got to have its specificity. That's what makes it both, I think, difficult, but also powerful when it is. Yeah.
You do a great job of trying to resist so many categories, but there's one that you seem very comfortable with.
Yes.
And maybe you talk more about this in the book, but you label Yiddishkayt a form of masculinity.
Yeah.
What about femininity? Where are Jewish women? Where is all of that?
It's basically, I think it's the same it's the same question, really. And I think it's there's no way for me to avoid that the kind of eros and desire that are fundamentally embedded in the figures that I'm drawing out has a masculine, even heterosexual masculine quality to it. And I have two options, which are, well, I could sort of expand it beyond what I'm drawn to say, right? But it's, again, that move that I want to resist. So in some ways, what I'd prefer, my image of how to relate to the need for this kind of broadening and diversification is to do it in its specificity and then invite it to be joined. Again, as I said, invite the next book. In my fantasies, I have ideas of American Yiddishkayt, the better, the real, and the sublime, right? And that could be written, say, by a Jewish woman who wants to then say Israel has completely exactly, and and then in the power plays in the tension that would happen between those two books, beautiful. I love it. That's the way I would want it to happen.
The more daring thing be to admit the femininity into your own point of view.
Well, I guess the question is whether or not I guess I'll say this. I think adding to the conversation diversity of masculinities, that is something that I can do more powerfully than what you're describing. That's my opinion. Yes?
The American Jewish conservative movement, exemplified by Norman Podhoretz in Commentary magazine, will certainly not embrace Yiddishkayt.
Not this one.
What is the alternatives to that kind of opposition?
Well, so again, and that one's even a little closer. It's a great example and something that I think a lot about. There's another sort of close cousin in the neoconservative movement and neoconservative Jewish intellectuals in the US. And it's a very lively and interesting and fruitful debate between people like Howe and Podhoretz, right? I guess in the same vein, I would want to invite the critique. You know, in a sense, I want the next generation of that group to come and write their rebuttal. And then, because frankly, that's a tension that I think is a very important one, and one that the American Yiddishkayt that I'm describing lives with dialectically, with a kind of familial push and pull, like the sense of, I think, Jewish femininity that also needs to sort of be there in the overall big, robust, living engagement with this legacy. So it's a great question. We got a lot of questions. Go ahead.
You said hate is as strong as death, in addition to love, and maybe anti-Semitism is a form of hate that threatens Judaism, but you said Yiddishkayt is something different. So I guess what are the things that threaten Yiddishkayt today?
Good question, Emily. Well, it does make me want to, though, note that, just briefly, that the way that I think about hate in this sense is actually what I address it in my first book, that where thriving, this kind of living hate can go is into the play sphere that I describe in my first book. Best case scenario. Oftentimes it doesn't get there, right? And that's your question. And so what threatens American Yiddishkayt? A lot of things. I mean, I think anti-Semitism certainly is often targeted at this, has historically often been more, especially in the modern period, more targeted towards this world, the secular, hyper-modernizing, socialistic, right? American Yiddishkayt than, for instance, the picture of the religious Jew, the pious Jew, right? So I do think that the kinds of anti-Semitism that we see emerging today do threaten American Yiddishkayt, but there is another kind of threat that is the kind that I started with, that is maybe even more relevant to our lives here, which is the dangers of certain kinds of institutionalization of certain kinds of categories and discourses, and forms of essentialization that are. It is too much of a problem. It is too inconvenient. It is too uncomfortable to have fuzzy things, fuzzy exploding things like this that are full of life and want to live. And want to live even though it's not good, and even though it's not just. Because this isn't about justice. My first book was about justice. This is not about justice. This is not everything people want is just. Right? Wants are not defined by justice per se. And so I think a world that really suppresses the kinds of thriving that are possible for human beings and moralizes them is one that threatens American Yiddishkayt, in my opinion. Thank you. There was behind you. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask you about justification. You said American Yiddishkayt cannot and doesn't want to be justified. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
Yes. You're all picking all the things that I want to talk about. That's great. Exactly. Well, so this is part of what I was just suggesting, which is, and maybe to add something that I haven't mentioned yet, though it's related, is that the kinds of Judaisms that are very prominent now are entirely preoccupied, one might say, with justification. We do it because it's just. Well, you know, it is the history of modern Jewish thought, as you know a little bit, I know from class, is often an attempt to make Jews and Judaism and Jewishness justifiable to the Gentile institutional structures that may or may not accept them. Look, we are a moral, ethical monotheism, and therefore, right, we belong. We can have a church, we'll just call it this, and we'll have the same stuff, but in a Hebrew font, and it'll be, right, it'll be very dignified and respectable, and right, or we have a culture, and cultures are supposed to be, or we have a nationality, we're a nationality. Nations get national self-determination. We could have that, right? Right, so, my thinking is, rather than a kind of Jewish thought that is constantly navigating and pushing and pulling off of these justificatory structures, there's a certain kind of propulsive internal reasons that work differently. They just want to come out. They just are motion forward, right? That's the kind of thing that it's very difficult for us to talk about, because we live in justificatory structures all the time, and we're constantly trying to justify ourselves. And I was referring to, when I used the term legitimation, Jürgen Habermas, the social theorist and political theorist, who in this early part of his career wrote about the way in which modern societies get caught in this need for justification, which inevitably, and other thinkers that have thought about this have focused more in this direction, result in skepticism, result in paralyzing skepticism, because the justificatory descent never ends. And in fact, the Star of Redemption, which there's a whole way in which this whole thing is just a response to the Star of Redemption, it was a response to the modern crisis of skepticism, the modern crisis of being stuck in a world of justificatory structures, all of which were undermined by each other and their own histories. So that's part of the impetus of trying to articulate, make visible, make subject to experience something that does not define itself in terms of justification. Yes, Catherine.
This is a question going back to your answer that a certain type of moralizing threatens American Yiddishkayt. One of your three things is the good. So saying like it's how does that hang together with the kind of unconcerned justice in a certain way?
Yeah. Well, so the use of the sense of the good is a little cheeky there, as I'm sure, right? Because it's not meant to be the good. It's kind of a play on the idea that there would be these universal, transnational, trans-historical ideas of the good. But it is a political project. But it's the difference is here. It's how do I know if the idea of the good in American Yiddishkayt is good? Right? That would be looking for justification. When you speak from American Yiddishkayt, you ask, what's the relationship between power and property? Right? Because that's the source of justification. And if you say, well, but is that good? Then you say, of course it is. Right? Maybe you don't think it is. I know it is. And it's the difference between, well, let me explain, well, according to this meta-ethical view or this kind of utilitarianism, right? It's not a philosopher's the good, right? It is what I have to push forward for, what seems obvious to me. It's the intuitions upon which you might construct a political theory, a political philosophy, an idea, and so forth. We could continue with that now. Thank you, Michael.
In the class a lot.
It's not required. I appreciate that.
We talk a lot about the collective consciousness of Jews and like whether or not that's a fair characterization of why Jews have survived for as long. I tend to think it is, but it's the thing, and for anybody else, like I think a fair definition is this thing that allows Jews to be Jews and survive throughout many, many years, despite like the evolutions of what it means to be Jewish. It feels to me like American Yiddishkayt is maybe a particularly American version of this collective consciousness. And I'm curious if you think that's a fair characterization, and if so, and maybe regardless, how essential you view it as to the continuation of Jews and survival of Jews, both in America and it sounds like in other countries as well.
It's a great question, Michael, and so Michael's in my current class, Modern Jewish Political Theory, and one of the people that we've read recently is Shimon Dubnov, right? Who is described sometimes as the diaspora nationalist, who wanted to see a kind of Jewish national thriving, but in Europe, right? Saying goodbye to my wife. So the answer is, it is a little bit more cut off than, for instance, the Zionist vision, which defines itself in terms of its capacity to create an access point for all Jews, right? So like Dubnov, but even more like some other figures who we haven't read in class, who are even more particular about being willing to cut off a kind of, say, Yiddish-speaking autonomous Jewish life as the thing that should thrive, with the sense of the rest of Jewish thriving, whatever that is, as kind of in the periphery. That's a little bit more where I am, which is to say, I don't want to offer, again, a grand theory, a total picture for the future of the Jews, including all of its institutions and so forth, right? I'm more inspired by Franz Rosenzweig, and that he would write a book like this, and then it would be powerful for people in all sorts of ways, and it would be a means for a life of study and engagement that happens in friendships and in families and in classrooms, right? And I'm happy to do that. And some people read Rosenzweig and then build off of that institutional ideas and so forth, and increase the scope and the scale. They can do it. I'm more interested in trying to capture the kernel that I think is the essential thing. Thank you. It's late. Do we want?